Today we are finishing up the series, and we're going to be looking at really sort of participation in the world as today we are that is finishing up how the world is the series, and we're going to be looking at, just by way of review, really sort of we began this whole process in the world as Western natural that got into that is the kind of stance that it's in. We looked at 1492 and the process, just by way of review, in terms of we began this whole expulsion of looking at Jews, and later how from what was about to become Spain, which was the first nation state that it's in. We looked at how that has 1492 part of the processes that it started, kind of like then in terms a way to represent the birth of expulsion, particle of the Jews, and later the Muslims, where reality is what denominated in terms Spain, of objects, the first nation states, and how that has things like that been other forms of particles. It's kind of like a way to represent, it's not the birth of we're not done until we get all of our music, where reality is denominated in terms of objects and individuals and digital format, because before that there's just that. There's just other forms of particles. Like not, the way, not ideal. We're not done until we particle becomes get all of our music idealized, digitized, of dealing with it. Get all our photos and make them in digital format. Because before that, they're just, of course, we looked at just sort of raw. Descartes, being the designer of this modern way of thinking, not idealize the world into particle becomes an idealized way of matter. You've got particles on one side and persons. Of course, we looked at the other side of the divide, and Descartes, being the designer of this modern way of thinking, when this whole system started, into that compromised matter didn't seem so costly, because both particles on one side, matter, particles and persons were seen as, on the other side of the divide, created by God. Therefore, that was the unifying factor. That wasn't, of course, a big problem. When this whole system started, when you got into that compromise, didn't seem so costly, because both the replacement matter, particles and persons, God with natural law created by God. And then, as you got, that was the unifying factor. It wasn't really a big problem. Sort of the 19th century, where, and by the 20th century, you started having this the replacement of process where God natural law, and then as you got the governing paradigm, and instead of natural law, the 19th century, where particles and persons, by the 20th century, you did a sort of very efficient shortcut, and in psychology of the 20th century, natural law became the assumption that particles produce persons. Sort of the governing paradigm, and instead of natural law that we have producing particles and persons, the whole problem with did a sort of very efficient shortcut in something that is not psychology of the 20th century. You have the way the world works, the assumption that particles, but even as recently as the 1950s, which gives we had only two tenets of psychology that we have today: psychoanalysis and behavior. The whole problem with psychoanalysis being something that is not, that whatever it is that you're doing in your regular life is really the result of, so even as conscious urges and instincts and desires that only you don't know about psychology. So you're not really in charge. Psychoanalysis and behavior processes inside psychoanalysis. And behaviorism says that whatever it is that you're just doing, look at what you do. The life is really the result. There isn't really any unconscious urges and instincts and desires that you don't know about. Machine doing it. So you're not really in charge. What's in charge is these. So both of those are inside of they're the natural product. Behaviorism that particles produce. Says, well, we just look at what you do, goes, and there's makes other really assumptions. But inside, essentially, it doesn't give just any biological machine doing its thing. We are intelligent living. So both of those are, they're the natural products. Of course, in response to this, the humanistic psychology came. Actually, psychoanalysis goes makes other assumptions, but essentially it doesn't give any looked at credence, challenging those approaches. We are intelligent. Now, in the early years, we talked about the importance of sort of that,
And
of course, in response to this,
spirituality,
humanistic psychology transformation in the early years. Humanistic early 1960s. Psychologists were completely against religion because they thought it's something that was challenging obstacle to the development of human potential. Now, in the early years, and we talked about the importance of Maslow, one of the founders of spirituality, psychology, and transformation. In the early years, other people, humanistic, who found a new psychologists were completely against religion because they thought transpersonal psychology something that was an obstacle to that development potential. Essentially, and what Maslow developed the idea that spirituality wasn't something one of the founders connected with religion. It was expressed several other people. It was a basic to found a new form, which became transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology is like a whole person. That was psychology. Essentially, that Maslow developed the idea that spirituality wasn't something healing, transformation with religion. It was expressed through religion, but non-ordinary states of consciousness, states of mind, and other than just that state where that transpersonal psychology is like a whole person psychology. Because if you go to regular psychology, pays particular attention that's the state around which healing, transformation, spirituality, and non-ordinary states. So transpersonal psychology looks at something other than just these other aspects that the experience is yakking at you and says, how does that redefine? Because if you go to regular psychology, that's really the only state. And that's the state around which the processes and experiences that people have transpersonal psychology looks at these other aspects, and regular psychology just doesn't give a lot of attention to those. How does that redefine the whole person if we take those into account? Transpersonal psychology started because those are the kinds of processes and experiences essentially saying that there is people transcended beyond another dimension, a hidden dimension behind the world, which is the source of psychology, just doesn't give the world's religions, which is the source of transformation, which is the thing that explains things that we can't. Humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, started with. We looked at the perennialist model, the shortcoming, which is essentially that model, saying that there is this transcendent divine, another dimension, a hidden dimension behind the participatory view, which is the source of really described religions, these as the source of transformation in the world, rather than which is the thing that explains things that we can't talk about scientifically. We also then we looked through the shortcomings of problems with that perennial philosophy, one being that it's metaphysical. If you take essentially that there is something that you can't really describe, you can't as being located in the world, have access to, that you can't examine, that other dimension. That is the hidden explanation. And of course the problem with that also then, once you open the door to hidden explanation, problems with the perennial philosophy, one being that it's metaphysical. There are all kinds of, essentially, there's an argument about something that which hidden can't see factor that you can't the real cause of what's going on, have access to, that they can't examine, that transcendent divine is the hidden explanation. Whatever else you want. The problem with that is, another problem is, once you open the door to hidden explanations, meaning that as long as you say, well, there are all kinds of explains. There is an argument all these things in the world that we can't explain scientifically. Factor is the real cause. You can say, well, yeah, okay, you could have anything. We can agree that there's some hidden dimension. But the minute you start describing what it is, whatever else you want, the minute you put description, specificity on it, now you start creating a hierarchy of different. Another problem is that perennialism is, and you start saying, well, this one's actually better than that one. That as long as you say, well, there's some hidden dimension, it actually explains all these things in the world. It actually is directly explained scientifically. So you can say, well, yeah, okay, in a very general way, there's some hidden dimension. But the minute you start describing what it is, the minute you put a specific on it, then it goes back and creates hierarchies. Description, specificity
I'm
on
sorry,
it.
I'm not understanding this graph.
Now you start creating.
All right, so for example, we
hierarchy of
talked
different
about the Wilbur system,
different traditions,
where
and you start
Wilbur
saying,
system,
well, this one's
where
actually
he said
better than that one.
the ultimate,
Because
that ultimate transcendent that
it
is
actually
behind the world that explains
reaches,
all
it
of
actually is
these
directed at that
transformative
very
processes
specific thing.
aliveness itself.
So,
is the non-dual.
perennialism, in a
The
very
non-dual
general way, is without
promotes
space
tolerance.
and but the minute you put a
is
specific on
the
it,
potentiality
then it
of the
goes
world.
back and creates hierarchy.
Everything in the world is created
I'm
out
sorry,
of
I'm not understanding this
the
graph.
non-dual.
Okay. So if you
All
take
right, so
that,
for example, we talked about the
as
Wilbur's
a
system,
description of
where
what that hidden transcendent divine
Wilbur
thing
system,
is,
where he said,
then you
the
start
ultimate,
looking
that
at the
ultimate
traditions of the world and
that
saying,
is
oh,
behind
well,
the
look,
world that
this one
explains
achieves
all
that.
of these
Oh, but this
transformative
one
processes
doesn't.
and aliveness itself.
So, for
is the
example,
non-dual.
indigenous
The
traditions,
non-dual,
they don't have the concept
is
of the without
non-dual.
time and
So they
space,
must be inferior.
and because
is the
that's not a
potentiality
path
of
that
the world.
brings you to a non-dual
Everything
realization.
in the world is
Therefore,
created
it's
out of
lesser.
But I wonder
non-dual.
if that is more about
So if
Ken
you
Wilber's
take that
ability to really understand
as
the
a description
complexities
of what
seems
that
a little
hidden
more
transcendent
sophisticated. I mean,
divine
even his
thing is,
estimation of Judaism,
then you
know,
start
comes out of a very
looking at the
loose
traditions of the
understanding
world and
that,
saying,
you
oh,
know,
well,
that,
look,
that leads
this
to
one
the
achieves
conclusion
that.
Judaism
Oh, but
does
this
not
one
deal with
doesn't.
non-dualism. But Judaism
So,
is
for
totally
example,
a non-dual
indigenous
practice,
traditions, they
basically.
don't have the concept
We'll let
of
you answer the
non-dual.
full.
So they must
So how much
Because
of that is
that's not a
reflective of a
path
very
that brings you
limited
to a
Western,
non-dual realization.
basically Christian,
Therefore,
no matter
it's
what
lesser.
he's doing now, his
But I
practice,
wonder
he
if
was
that,
raised
you know,
in a Christian environment, I assume.
if that's
So
really
there's a very limited
more
ability
about
to really
Ken
pierce
Wilber's
through
ability to really
other
understand
traditions
the
from their
layers and
point of view.
complexities of
So-
what seems to
And
be
that's
okay.
exactly
Even his
one of the
estimation of
critiques,
Judaism,
is that
Comes out of
his
a very
understanding, or
limited
anybody's understanding of other
that,
traditions,
that
is going
leads
to be
them
limited
the
by their own
conclusion that
location.
Judaism
Right.
does not deal
So
with
that
non-dualism. But
If you're
Judaism
putting
is-
together a
Judaism is
grand
totally
schema of how
non-dual
everything
practice.
reflects one transcendent
Basically.
ultimate,
We'll let you
you're
answer the
still
full.
doing it very limited. And
So how much
I
of
would
that is
say-
limited
But
reflective
generous,
of a very
basically.
limited
Yeah, right.
Western,
Right.
basically Christian, no
And-
matter what he's doing now, his practice, he's raised
And,
in a Christian
um,
environment, I assume.
I would
So
say
he has a very
that of the
limited
people, of
ability
the
to really
models
pierce
and the
through
attempts
other traditions
a
from their point of view.
Perennialist model.
So-
and
Wilbur has
that's
gone
exactly
into more detail.
one of the critiques,
More
is
research.
that more effort, his
to
understanding,
understand
or
how
anybody's
everything might
understanding of other traditions
together
is
than
going to be limited
anybody
by our
else's
own
thought.
location.
Location.
I mean, in terms of an effort,
So
that
It's brilliant.
if you're
It's-
putting together a
it's
grand schema of how
staggering
everything
in
reflects
its
one transcendent
ambition and
ultimate,
complexity.
you're still doing it from a very
And,
limited place.
and really in,
I would
But
say,
limited but generous,
you know,
basically.
yeah, right, right.
Right.
The point being that
Or
even a very sophisticated
and
model,
um,
I would say that
has
of the models,
real
of the
ambition.
attempts. So
at a perennialist
you're right
model.
about
Wilbur has
Judaism,
gone into more detail.
but for example,
more
let's
research,
say more effort.
let's say
to
that you
understand
have
how everything might fit together than anybody else has
Shinto.
done.
Right.
I mean, in terms of an effort, and
It's brilliant.
maybe you know more
It's-
about
it's
this than I do, but my
staggering.
opinion is that in its ambition and complexity, you
Mm-hmm.
have there's this
And,
relationship with
and really
local
in-
spirits, the kami, that are
cleverness.
essentially to be a
The
relationship
point being
being
that
that even a very
in a
sophisticated model, you appease them, you bring them offerings,
Has
and they assist you.
Real limitation.
So there isn't the concept
So,
of some, you're right,
so
about dimensionless. But for example, let's
world
say,
behind
let's say that you
the visible
have,
world.
there is a very real relationship with these
Shinto.
spirits that have location in the
And
world, because
maybe
they
you know
are
more
about this than I
this
do.
shrine,
My
or
understanding is that
it's-
that grove of trees,
You have
there's this relationship
have
with
a relationship
local
with
spirits,
invisible
kami,
presences that
that
located in the
are
world.
which is very
to
different
be
than
a
saying
relationship to be
that there is a
cultivated,
non-dual that has
you
no
appease them,
character, personality,
bring them
or
offerings, and then they assist
or
you.
specificity.
So there
location.
isn't the concept of
Right,
some,
but I wonder if that's
sort of
because
dimensionless
the Western
world
methodology is looking for
the
something
visible
that's
world.
articulated
There is a very
that
real
in other
relationship
cultures
with the
they don't even
spirits that
bother
have
articulating it because it's so
location in the
implicit.
world. 'Cause
So,
they are
you know, if you go to an indigenous
this
culture,
shrine
for
or
instance, and
in
start
that
asking them
grove of
about
trees,
what their process
have-
of intuition is all about.
you have a
You know,
relationship
they'll say
with
intuition, what is that?
invisible
But
presences
it's not because
that are located
they don't
in the
use
world,
intuitive process,
which
it's
is
because
very different
it's one of their
than
senses, the
saying
way
that there is
they're
a
hearing and
non-dual
they're seeing.
that
So
has
it's, you
no
know, so they don't
character,
have
personality.
they don't have a
or-
whole theorem based around that.
specificity
They
of
don't have a
location.
whole philosophy based
Right,
around that.
but
It
I
just
wonder
is,
if that's
right?
because
And I
the
wonder,
Western,
when
you
you
know, inquiry
look at
methodology.
Shintoism, for instance,
You know, sort
you
of,
can see
yeah,
that, yes, it's a
um,
relation, there's a relational thing
basically,
going on about
you know,
spirits and
comes
location.
with
But perhaps
the,
that's what we see,
gosh,
but
my
what
cognitive
is implicit in
brain's just
people's
not all
understanding
on
and just relationship with this morning, but
But
anyway,
anyways,
in the world,
is that
the
it
Western
represents
methodology is looking
that is more
for
transcendent
something that's
and
articulated
non-dual.
that in other
the
cultures, the way Hinduism, they don't even bother articulating it because it's so implicit.
gods and goddesses.
So,
was like,
you know,
wow,
if you go
we
to
didn't
an
think
indigenous
that.
culture,
Well, actually,
for
only
instance,
some
and
forms
start
of
asking them about
Oh, okay.
what
Yeah,
their
because
process of
I know there was
intuition
really
is all
different
about.
Astika, the Nastika,
You know, they'll
the
say
different schools.
intuition,
and
what is
some
that?
of them
Okay,
don't
it's not
even
because
believe
they don't use
in,
intuitive process, it's
transcendence
because
at all.
it's one of their
Okay,
senses,
to my
the
point.
way
Yeah.
everything
So
they're
to your
hearing
point,
and they're seeing is a,
I'm on
you know,
her
so
side.
that they don't
Oh.
have, they don't have, but,
It really gets
you know,
taken
theorem
aside in a
based
couple
around
counts.
that.
I'm
They don't-
on her side. That's exactly what I'm
just
thinking. Can I
is,
just say one
right?
thing?
Absolutely,
When
and
you
I
said, when
wonder,
you started to talk about indigenous peoples a few
you know,
minutes ago, I
when
thought you
you
were going to say, and there's such a
look at
non-dual
Shintoism, for instance.
culture,
you
and
can
in
see
fact, you
that,
said just
yes,
the
it's a
opposite of what
relation-
I
there's
thought
a
you were going to
relational
say,
thing going
because
on
I think
about
it's-
spirits
I
and
think it's exactly
location.
what you're saying, Caleb.
But perhaps that's
To
what
my
we see,
eye,
but
to
what
my
is
ear, my
implicit
Western ear,
in people's
not
understanding of
indigenous
this
cultures
relationship
seem
with,
exactly like
with their
Shintoism,
lives in
you
the
know, where you
world
have
is that it represents, you know, a much bigger picture that is more transcendent
You have
and non-dual.
identifiable,
The way Hinduism is
you know,
non-dual
it's
from
symbols or
Western mind,
idols
when we
or
first
gods,
encountered
but
gods and
the
goddesses,
aspects,
it was
but
like,
they
wow,
represent
what a
something
pagan thing
so
that is.
otherworldly.
Well, actually, only some forms of Hinduism. Okay, so
Okay,
Yeah,
can I just say
this
one more
is-
thing?
yeah,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
just in
Nastika,
response, and
Nastika,
because I
the
still need
different
to, just
schools,
one more
some of them
paragraph.
don't even believe
Which is,
in
and perhaps
transcendence at all.
what Mary's
Okay,
bringing
to
up
my
and I
point.
bring up is
So to your
why
point,
perennialism doesn't work,
I'm on
as
her
you're
side.
saying, and we
Oh.
need to.
It really gets taken aside in a couple of counts. That I'm on her side. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Can I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
When you said, when you started talking about
Locations that can
indigenous
only
peoples a few
view
minutes
through
ago, I
our
thought you were going to say,
location,
and there's such a
rather
non-dual
than some neutral place where we
culture,
can
and in
see what
fact, you said
everybody
just
else
the
is
opposite of
doing,
what I thought
then
you
we're
were
sort
going to
of
say.
owning
Because I think it's exactly what you're
our,
saying,
first
Caleb.
of all, our limitation for perception.
To my
But we're
eye,
also
to my
owning
ear, my
that
Western ear, indigenous
they have their
cultures
location,
seem
and we have
exactly
our
like
location,
Shintoism, you know, where you
and
have
all
these
is groovy and good. I mean, is that really what we're, is that it? It's just sort of a step toward
You
realizing
have,
the limitations of perennialism, so so co-participatory
it's
is sort of the
symbols
next
or
step, and
idols
just
or
own the
gods, but
aspects.
the aspects,
those
but they represent
limitations
something
and
so
owning-
otherworldly.
You know what I mean? Is it,
Okay,
Let me
so
back up.
okay,
Let me
can I
back
just
up.
say one more
Okay.
thing?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
absolutely.
Just in
First of
response,
all,
and because I still need to just, there's one more paragraph to what I have to
the
say.
process
Which is,
of
and perhaps
trying to
what
figure
Mary's
out-
bringing up and what I'm bringing up is why
Actually, let me just
perennialism
do a
doesn't
couple
work,
more,
as you were saying, and we need to move
points
over to
here,
a more
and then I'll come
location-based
the third objection to
participatory
perennialism is that
perception.
it's
Because
not clear that
as
it
long
really
as you
fits all the
recognize that
facts.
there are all these different locations, and that
Because
we're in a location
spiritual
that can
beliefs and
only
practices
view
are
through our
often shaped
location,
by the
rather than some neutral
visionary
place
or
where we
mystical
can see what
experiences
everybody
of
else
their
is doing,
founders.
then we're sort of
And
owning
one of the things
our, first of all, our
that
limitation for
in
perception.
the last 30 years,
But we're
the
also
relatively
owning
new
that
field of comparative mysticism
They have their
has-
location, and we have our
has
location.
demonstrated is that there
and
is
all
not
is
good
good.
evidence.
I mean, is that really
that
what we're,
would
is that it? It's just sort of a
people from
step
different
toward
cultures,
realizing the
backgrounds,
limitations
and
of perennialism,
other
so
kinds of
so
location,
co-participatory is sort of the next step, and just owning
have mystical experiences
those
that
limitations
they're the
and
same.
owning,
There's
you know what I
very
mean?
little
Is it,
evidence. Let me back up.
okay,
There's enough
Okay.
consistency in that to say, oh
First
yeah,
of all,
everybody really is having the same experience. The process of trying
if the
to figure
experiences
out
that are shaping
Actually, let me just do a couple more the tradition, and then I'll come back, are not the same.
The third objection,
then there are
is
differences
that in the tradition,
not
it's not clear that it really fits all the facts.
It's
Harder to
because
argue that really the
spiritual
beliefs and
things going
practices
on.
are often shaped by the
to the
visionary
point
or
about
mystical experiences of their founders.
maybe Westerners just
and
don't see.
one of the things is really that this assumed in the last 30 years of the relatively new field, the only mysticism way to find that out demonstrated is that there is not good evidence that when people from different immersed backgrounds, anthropological inquiry,
other kinds
over
of
location, a long time, not
have
mystical
the
experiences.
I'm the Western
anthropologist. There's very little
looking
at
at
you
you
from outside, but
there's enough
I'm going to come
consistency
and
to
say, oh yeah,
try
try
to
to immerse
really
myself in
is having the
experiencing
same
your culture as
experience.
much as I can, given the fact that I will never
So,
have been born here. Try to understand as much as I can from the inside. If the
inside.
experiences that are shaping do that over a long enough period of time with enough cultures to answer that
The
question,
traditions
that's the only way to get a real are
answer.
not the same. And then there are differences
other-
in the traditions. Possibility. There is the possibility. It's harder to argue that really all is going on. Every culture in the world has the same assumption about
To the point
about dimensions
maybe Westerners
just don't see. There's also the possibility that when assumed non-dual dimension, a Westerner the only way to find
anyone else comes
that
around and
out.
says,
Okay, so let's talk about to do sort of your belief in non-dual
immersed
transcendent anthropological inquiry. The Western anthropologists a long time not indigenous tribes not well show us your medicine. I'm the Western anthropologist. When in fact you've been outside, much of the time it was a medicine woman. I'm going to come and try to immerse myself
Is it
in
that
the experience of your
that
as much
assumption
as
is
I
really
can,
there, and we just
given
don't
the fact
see it because
that
of
I
our
will
cultural
never
blinders
have been
or
born
is
here. That question itself
and
a product
try
to really
of
understand as
cultural
much as I can from the inside assumption. Do that
Right,
over a long
and
enough
that
period
points
of
to
time
that,
with
it's
enough
from,
cultures
it's
to
in the
answer that
Western
question.
culture
That's
that
the
we're in
only
our
way to get
heads
a real
enough to
answer.
actually create,
The other
methodology at all
possibility, there is the
for
possibility
inquiry about this.
that
So when you
really
apply,
every culture in the
a
world has the same
cerebral-oriented
assumption about
inquiry into something that other cultures just
dimensionless
implicitly live every day.
transcendent. There's
you
also
know,
the possibility
then you're
that
also
when
breaking the barrier into having
a Westerner
to find
like Ken
language
Wilber or anyone else comes around and
actually
says, okay,
command
so
an
let's talk
articulation
about
from them. That's right. That's
Your belief in
intellectually,
the
actually
non-dual transcendent.
intellectualizing
that it's
what
like
their experience,
the
their
Western
embodied
anthropologists who
experiences.
came
We
to
intellectualize about embodied
indigenous tribes and
experience.
said, well, show us your medicine
man.
man.
They just
live it in
live it.
when in
Exactly.
fact so much of the time it was a
the point
medicine
here
woman.
is
Not so much to get to the real
is it that
that assumption is really there
because
and we just
every
don't
explanation
see it
has
because of our
limitations.
cultural
Every
blinders,
model
or
has
is that
limitations.
question itself
Whether
whether it's really that these
cultural
people assume a dimensionless transcendent,
Right.
or
and
that
points
they
to that.
assume
It's in the Western culture that
an
we're in our
invisible
heads enough
presence
to
that has
actually
location
create,
in the world is to me less important
methodology
to this
at all
project, which is
for
about
our
how to talk
inquiry
about
this.
transformative
So when you apply,
process,
a
healing,
cerebral-oriented
transformation in a
inquiry
Western
into
context in a
something
way
that other
that
cultures just implicitly
can
live
have
every day.
credibility.
Then
in a
you're
scientifically
also
oriented
breaking the
culture.
barrier into having to
Okay, could I just
find
I
language
should just respond
and
because
actually
I've
command
been
an
doing-
articulation
been
from
in
them.
these classes.
That's
what keeps
right.
coming
That's
back to me is
intellectually,
that
actually
it's a way
intellectualizing
of speaking
what
about
their
and
experience,
talking
their
about
embodied experiences.
transformation,
We
but
intellectualize
very
about embodied experience.
specific
They
location
they
of
just
philosophical
live it.
stance.
Exactly.
If I were to talk about
So
transformation from
the
spiritual
point here is not so much to
location,
get to the
I'd be
real
speaking here
explanation,
from my spiritual self. I'd be speaking about
because every
transformation very
explanation has its
differently
limitations.
Then
Every
when
model
we're
has
talking
its
the kind of
deficiencies. So
language
whether
that
it's
we're doing
really
here.
that these people
This is
assume
everything here is very much
a
within
dimensionless transcendent,
the
or that they
articulation
assume
of philosophical lens.
an
Not a
invisible
spiritual
presence that has
lens,
location
not
in the world
a,
is
those every
to me,
day
less
how you
important
live in the
to
world
this
lens,
project,
although you can
which
apply
is about how
philosophy
to
to
talk
that.
about
It's a pretty theoretical lens.
process. Well,
Healing,
spirituality,
transformation
always
in the
carries an
Western
implicit
context,
philosophy
in a way that
always carries an
can
implicit set
have
of assumptions about reality,
credibility
also,
in a
it doesn't
scientifically
always
oriented
unpack
culture.
them.
but they can be unpacked.
Right.
Okay, could I need to
But-
just respond, because in
With
doing
that,
in
to that
being
point,
in
it
these
starts,
classes,
it could
what
start
keeps
from
coming
a
back
very
is that esoteric
it's a way of
concept,
speaking
but
about
how
it
it's
and talking
then
about
dribbled down
transformation,
into
but from a very
everyday
specific
communication and
location of
transmission
philosophical
can be
stance.
very, very different.
If I were to talk
as
about
it,
transformation
as
from
it's
a
embodied in
spiritual
relationship.
I
I'd
don't
be
quite
speaking, from my
follow you on
spiritual
that.
self. I'd be
Well, you
speaking
can
about
have,
transformation very
in
differently
most,
Yep.
than
my experience
what
is
we're
that
talking
in
the
most,
kind of languaging that we're doing here.
traditions,
Because everything here is
that
very
there are
much
those
within
who are in the
involved in the
articulation
very
of
esoteric,
a philosophical lens,
not a
stratified
spiritual,
esoteric
Okay.
discussion.
not a,
Right.
right?
Those,
So
So
there's
every
always
day,
those
how
esoteric,
you
that
live in the
esoteric
world
that
then,
exists
well,
in
they
the
can apply
tradition.
philosophy
and then
to
people
that.
just
It's a pretty theoretical.
But then there are all these
Well,
different levels of people, how people are
spirituality
living it,
always
speaking of
carries
it, and
an implicit
transmitting it.
philosophy. Sure.
you know.
Always carries. But
an
at the same
implicit
time,
philosophy
people who are
about
living it and
reality
transmitting it,
also.
it can still
It
hold
doesn't
the
always
same
impact them.
assumptions about
But they can
reality,
Right.
even though those people
Right.
may not be aware of them.
I agree. But it's-
And the
with
reason
that-
for all
to that
this
point,
is
it
that in a
starts- it
scientific
could
culture
start
there
from
are
a
certain
very,
assumptions
esoteric,
that if you go to the
concept,
medical field,
but how it's
to
then dribbled down
the science, to
into
the psychological
you know,
field,
everyday communication
to
and
any kind
transmission
of
can be very, very
um,
different
scholarly
as
or
it's
academic
embodied
field,
in relation
or
in relationship.
I don't know if it has research. There's a set of assumptions
Well, you can
about
have,
the world
in
being a
most,
place where particles
my
produce
experience
force.
is that in most
So in order
um,
to have an alternate, in order
traditions,
to make
that there are
transformative
those who are
work real
involved
in
in
the world,
the very
it's
esoteric,
necessary in this world.
stratified
because
esoteric
that's the world that we
discussions.
live in
Right.
comfortably.
So there's always those
In order to do
esoteric,
that,
that
we have to-
esoteric that exists in whatever
It's
tradition.
necessary. And people just living it, it seems to me.
But then there are all these
to go
different
back
levels of people,
and
how
unpack
people are living
those
it,
assumptions are
speaking
that
of it,
the
and
culture
transmitting it,
sits with.
you know.
But at the
Just
same
the way you
time,
said,
people who
mostly
are living it and
unconscious.
transmitting it, it can
But
still
still hold
hold
to
the
the
same 17th and
assumptions
18th
about
century,
reality.
Right.
even
You
though
go,
those people may
"Oh,
not be
right.
aware.
Here's where people were actually saying those things.
And the reason for all this
Those things
is
that are just
in a scientific
assumed
culture,
there
there
are
are
certain
certain
nobody even
assumptions
talks about anymore.
that
If you
if
go
you go
to
to the medical field,
cognitive
to
behavioral
psychologists, to the psychological
and
field, they can do a lot of
to
good and really help
any
people.
kind
If you go to
of,
them and say, do you believe the particles produce
scholarly
persons or academic field, or most of them would never
Anything
have
has
thought of
research
that.
before.
There's a set of assumptions
But if you
about the
pursue
world
it
and unpack
being
them
a
a place
little
where
bit,
particles
well,
produce
yeah,
persons.
I guess maybe that is
So
what
in
I
order
believe.
to have an alternate,
So it's
in
by
order to make
unpacking
transformative those assumptions
work,
seeing where they came from,
And
it's
that
necessary
work
in this world. In this world, because
And
that's the
then
world that we live
looking
in.
for
Okay, in order to do
an
that,
alternative
that will stand up to critical
it's
thinking.
necessary, it seems to me,
Perennialism
to
doesn't
go
stand up to
back
critical
and
thinking.
unpack
In a sense,
those
assumptions are that the culture sits
So
with what's
just in the way you
alternative.
said,
mostly
that's
that's
what
what
this
this
process
process
is.
is. We have to go back to the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a
To go,
way of
"Oh,
saying,
right.
if
Here's what
somebody
people
comes
were
to you,
actually
if you're
saying
involved in
those
doing
things.
transformative work,
Those
someone
things
comes
that
to
are
you
just
and says,
assumed unconsciously.
you know,
that
how is
nobody
it
even
that this
talks about
works?
anymore?
If you go to a being able
Cognitive
to
behavioral
both recognize what
psychologists
meaning frame they're working
and
in, they can do
and
a lot of good and
if
really help
needed,
people.
being
If you go to
able
them
to have a meaning
and say, do you believe the
stand
particles
up
produce persons?
to
Most of them
cultural criteria.
would never have thought of that
Could you
before.
somewhere during this
But if you
class
pursue
or
it
the end
and
of the
unpack
class
it a little bit, they probably say, well, yeah, I guess
speak to that
maybe that
person
is what I believe.
who's inquiring about
So
that?
it's
who's
by
not intellectual?
unpacking
So that it's a
those
non-intellectual, it's
assumptions,
not an intellectual
seeing
theoretical
where they
discussion.
came from
It's an
historically and
everyday
culturally.
discussion. How do you
And
to
then
transplant
looking for
this very
an
esoteric,
alternative that will
theoretical,
stand up to critical
philosophical
thinking.
discussion into an everyday
Perennialism
how I
doesn't
talk
stand
about
up to critical
transformation
thinking
to
in a
Joe
scientific
Schmo who's
culture.
walked into my office.
Exactly,
So
that's a
what's-
great question.
And
what's
you
the
know, and how do I
That's what this
represent my
process is.
location? In that kind of way.
It's a way
my
of
sense is-
saying,
is-
if somebody comes to you,
that's
if you're involved in doing transformative
Funny
work,
you should ask.
you know, how is it
She's a
that this
plant.
works? Hang with
Yeah.
me. Being
Right, this is the
able
pillow talk we have.
or recognize what meaning frame they're working with. And if
So
needed,
the point
being
of
able to have a meaning frame that will stand up.
where we started this was that the
perennial
cultural
philosophy
criteria is an attempt
Could you somewhere during this
try
class, or during
to
the class,
make sense of
speak to that person
the fact that there's
who's
real
inquiring about
transformative
that,
process
not
and
intellectual,
healing
Mhm.
so that it's a
aliveness and
non-intellectual, it's not an
spirituality
intellectual
in
theoretical
human
discussion.
experience,
It's an everyday
It's a way to try to
discussion.
explain it.
How do you
because
to
if you look at the world
transplant this
through a
very
scientific lens,
esoteric theoretical
it's just a made-up thing. It
philosophical
doesn't, there's
discussion
no room
into
for
an
it.
everyday how I talk
It's
about
kind of like
transformation
what
to
happened
Joe
in
Schmo who's walked into my
the
office.
18th and
Mhm.
19th
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
a great
early 20th
question.
And, you know,
centuries.
and how do I represent my location?
Theory called the
in
God
ha-
of
you know,
gas,
in that kind of
whereas
way?
you've
So
got more and more
that's- that's-
scientific
that's-
theories for
that's-
things.
That's a really important.
People who made the
Funny
argument
you
for
should
God
Right,
was kept saying,
She's a
well, okay,
plant,
so
isn't she?
natural law
Yeah.
is this and this and
Right,
this.
this is the
But it
pillow
doesn't
talk we
explain
have.
that. Therefore, that's where God is. Oh, now we have a theory
So
for that.
the point
well,
of-
there's still a gap over here, so that's where God is. Where we started this
And you
was
could
that move it into
perennial
the
philosophy
modern world
is
is
an
an
attempt.
attempt. That's where consciousness
To try
is, or that's where
to
transformation is, so that you have
make
people
sense
saying,
of
well, we
the
don't
fact
really
that
understand
there's
that thing
real
about quantum
transformative
physics.
process.
So that's where
healing
consciousness is.
and
That's what explains
aliveness and
consciousness.
spirituality in human experience.
Because when you, it's a way to try to explain it. As more and more
Because
things are explained,
if you look at the world
terms, through a scientific lens, gets to be less
just a
and
made-up
less
thing.
room. It doesn't
There's
really
no room
the
for
divine,
it.
whether you call it consciousness.
It's kind of like
call it
what happened
transformation,
in
whether you call it aliveness,
18th and 19th,
whatever it is that you
20th,
call
early
it.
20th
But that
centuries.
thing that actually makes life worth living. That thing that's
theory
actually
called
the God of
interesting
gas
part of life.
Whereas
rather than
you've got more and
simply,
more scientific
okay,
theories for
I'm
things.
doing the same old thing again.
People who
and-
made the argument
and
for
we're
God,
just following the same old
transformation,
rules, whatever.
It's like it was.
I
Kept
spoke
saying,
once
well,
to somebody
okay, so
who
natural
an
law
engineer
explains this and this and
all
this
his life.
but it doesn't explain that.
And he was
Therefore,
really
that's where God
bored
is.
with it.
Because in engineering,
Oh,
there
oh, now
are
we have a
almost
theory for
never
that.
any new
Well,
discoveries. There's still a gap over here, so
What
that's
we
where
have
God is.
is
And you could
a
move
set
it
of
into
rules that
the
you
modern
learn,
world,
and
and
you
you
could
apply
say
them for the rest. That's
of
where
your career.
consciousness is.
That's
or
what you
that's
do.
where
There isn't
transformation,
innovation.
so that you have people
There
saying,
isn't any discovery.
well, we don't really
There isn't
understand that
any
thing about
forward
quantum
movement in
physics.
the field.
So that's where consciousness
I mean,
is.
once
That's
in a while
what
to figure out how to
explains
build a bridge on, a
Because
suspension
when
bridge
you
supported on one pillar, like
as more and more
bridge
things
here
are
in
explained
the Bay
in
Area.
mechanistic
terms.
but
There
there gets to be less.
a lot
and
of that
less
has to
room
do with
whether you call it
better
divine,
materials.
whether you call it consciousness, whether you
A
call
little
it
bit of different
transformation,
design.
whether you call it
It's
aliveness.
not like there's some
whatever it
breakthrough.
is that you call it. But that thing that actually makes life
with
worth
life
living
is just kind of like you,
that
you
thing
wake
that's
up in this
actually
life and you go,
the
well,
interesting part of life.
everything's all set.
There's no
Now,
adventure,
sort of
no
the-
discovery.
okay,
This is just how it is. Just
I'm
live
doing
it out.
the same
and
old thing
you're
again.
done.
and we're
it-
just
it-
following the same old
it
rules.
takes a lot of
It's like
interest out of
I
it.
spoke once to
So,
somebody who'd been an engineer all of his
part
life.
that sort of
And he
makes
was really
gives
bored with
life
life.
because in engineering
Life.
there are almost never any new discoveries. Gets explained
What you have
away is by the sort of mechanical
a set of rules that
scientific
you
view.
learn,
So
and
how
then
do
you
we put
apply
that?
them for the
How do
rest
we
of
say,
your career.
But and that's all you do. There isn't
Experience
any
innovation.
something more than that.
There
How do
isn't
we
any
explain
discovery.
that?
Perennialism tries
There
to explain
isn't
it
any
by
forward
this hidden
movement
secret
in the field.
transcendent dimension.
I mean,
Once in a
that
while to figure out how to
you
build a
can't,
bridge on
that you can't
really
suspension
get any
bridge
evidence for
supported on
unless
one
you
pillar,
believe
like the new bridge
unless you
here.
already believe with the Bay Area.
So that's
That's a lot of that has
the
to do
problem
with
with that model is that
better
if you,
materials.
if you start putting specifics on it,
A
and you
little
start
bit of
really
different
trying to
design.
develop it, it's not like
Doesn't
there's some
hold
breakthrough
up very well.
It
So
doesn't with
do
life is just kind of like
that
you
thing
wake up in this
of
life and go,
helping
well,
to
explain everything's all set,
transformation,
no adventure, no
aliveness,
discovery.
consciousness,
This is just how it
whatever it
is.
is.
Just live it out, and
In
you're done.
a world
That
tries to
takes a
explain
lot of
everything
interest out of it.
through figuring
So,
out what particles it's made.
That doesn't do it. Part that sort of makes that gives
Very
life.
How's this? Lane?
Gets explained away by the sort of
I'm
mechanical scientific view. So how do we put that? How do we say?
I'm
but
just
you
going
know,
to say this.
I
All
really
throughout this series, I
experience that
thought
there's something more than that. How
this
do we explain
challenge
that?
in here is
Perennialism
just
tries to
words,
explain it
things that are
by this
so,
hidden secret transcendent
you know,
dimension
that you
that
get bogged down
you
in the
can't
words, I think, and
that you
I
can't
just,
really
I just
get
did
any
this-
evidence
I
for
just
unless you
did a
believe it.
two-day training
Unless
Friday
you
initially,
already
and at
believe
the end
it.
of it, it's very, very rich.
So that's-
At the end of it,
that's
everybody in the room is thinking, how do I work,
The
how to
problem
explain
with
this?
that model is
to
that
my clients, to
if
my
you
friends,
start putting specifics on it, if you start
the
really
presenter
trying to
sort
develop
of,
it, it doesn't hold up
I think
very
he
well.
anticipated that because he said,
It
don't
doesn't
try
do
and talk about this
that thing
from a
of
theoretical.
helping
It's
to
not talk about
explain
it at all.
transformation,
Put into
liveness,
practice what makes sense
consciousness,
to
whatever
you
it
in
is,
any
in
moment. And
a
that
world
seemed to be a lot of what
that
you said the
tries to
very
explain
first time you
everything
came here, which was
through
assume you know
figuring
some
out
of
what
this.
particles this mean.
And that
Doesn't do it.
you have to just sort of sit with it. And it's a lot
Mary,
to sit
is that-
with. I just, it's an act of
How's
faith.
this landing? Yeah, and I hope in an hour or so it will be less of an act of faith.
Yeah. It usually is.
There's a rhythm to these
all throughout this
Sundays, I
series, I
think.
thought,
And that
this challenge in here is
for
for me,
speaking words to things that are so,
I have to settle into the cadence, your voice, and and your
just beautiful
I
visuals
just
that
I
I
get
get
sidetracked.
sidetracked
We
by.
did a two-day training.
And then
Friday
somewhere
initially,
sort
and
of
at the end of it,
an
it's
hour,
very,
hour and a
very
half.
rich. And at the end of it is everybody in the room is
Things
thinking,
start
how do I work, how to explain this
Mhm.
to my clients, to my friends, and
feel
if
free.
the presenter sort of
And, I
I think he
appreciate it.
anticipated that.
No, absolutely not. Because that's what helps to bring other people out.
My job in many of these workshops is to
And
sort of
that
express
seemed to
what
be
the
a
room
lot of
is.
what you said the
is
very
thinking
first
about,
time you
actually.
came. Right.
I take that on
Assume you know some rights,
consciously.
and that you
So,
have to just
so
sort of
how's
sit
this
with
landing
it.
with you?
And it's a lot to sit with.
Well, yeah, I mean, I sort of get it. I mean,
It's
you
an
know,
act of faith.
if I were to
Yeah,
say,
and I hope in an hour or so it will be less of an act of
You're
faith.
saying in an hour.
It
you know,
usually
clearer.
is. But,
How this
there's a
would work
rhythm
in
to these
everyday life,
Sundays,
I
I
would
think.
say
And
that
that,
rather than assuming
for me,
that all people doing
I have
whatever work they're
to
doing
settle
on a
into
spiritual
the
level
cadence,
are going to,
your
are doing the
voice,
same
and,
work
and your beautiful
eventually
visuals
having the
that I
same
get
states of
sidetracked by
consciousness.
sometimes. And then
That
somewhere,
what
sort of
feels
an
more
hour,
right
an hour and a half,
more real, and
into
actually
this,
in many ways
things
more
start to
humble
pull
in a good way. Is
So, and,
that I can recognize
feel
my
free.
location and I can honor theirs.
And,
And honor that for
I
me,
appreciate
there's mystery there.
No, absolutely not. Because that's what helps
Right.
to bring
No,
other people out.
Yeah,
My job in
And
many of these
I will not
workshops
make
is to
those
sort of
assumptions.
express, and I think with perennialism, one thing tend to make assumptions.
Right.
I take that when you move from perennialism into
It's
a location-based
So,
perspective,
so how's this landing with
the
you?
presumptions and assumptions
Well,
are less.
yeah,
I mean, I
Because
sort
your
of get it.
ownership
I
of
mean,
where
you
you
know,
sit is
if
more.
I were to say,
that's
where
I am, and I'm probably jumping
Yeah.
ahead because
Have
you're
you-
saying in an hour.
Okay, here's another way to
you know,
talk about
clearer
all the limitations of
how
perennialism.
this would work in everyday
Have you ever had any-
life, I would
somebody
say
that
that rather than assuming that all
Have you ever
people
had somebody-
doing whatever work they're doing
Fair
on
enough.
a spiritual level
And-
Does that fit with
are
you?
doing the same
What?
work.
What I
Yes.
said?
Yes.
Okay, eventually
I
having
just
the
want to
same
amplify it
states
a
of
little bit.
consciousness. That
What I want
what
to say
feels
is that I like
more
it
right
too.
and
I
more
like it
real,
as a
and actually
very
in many ways
general
more humble
kind of
in
thing.
a good way.
As a non-specific
Is that
kind
I
of
can
thing. And the point is that
recognize
once
my
you start putting
location and I can honor
specifics
theirs.
on it, it breaks
And
down.
honor that for me,
Once you try
there's
to say,
mystery
"Oh,
there.
that's a
I'm
good
not
idea.
really sure.
Let me
or
really
clear
try
or informed
to
about
put
what
that
their
into
how their
practice.
location
Let me try to
informs
apply
them.
that in a detailed way.
We're
talking about
I,
perennialism.
Yes.
and I will
It
not make
breaks
those
down.
assumptions. And I think
So,
with
for example,
perennialism,
have
one
you ever
can
had
tend to
any of you
make
had a
assumptions.
conversation
But when you
and
move
you
from
are
perennialism
telling
into
a very
location-based
sort of specific,
perspective,
very personal
the
experience,
presumptions and assumptions
and someone
are
says, "Oh,
less.
yeah, I know just what you mean.
Because your
I know
ownership
just
of
what
where
you mean.
sit is
Here's
more
my story. Blah 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 blah."
Right.
And you go and you say, "Well,
Have
no."
you-
Here's
Actually,
another way to talk about one of the
that's not what I
limitations
mean.
of
What I mean
perennialism.
is this. Have you ever had any?
No.
somebody-
See, that's not what you mean.
This is what you mean. Have
What
you
you
ever
mean
had
is
somebody
like what-
fair
what I
enough?
share.
And,
Does that fit with
so
you?
perennialism.
What?
What I
Yes.
said?
Yes.
Okay.
I just want to amplify
contrast to what
Yeah.
you said about
owning
what I
one's
want to say
location and
is
saying,
that I like
"This is my
too.
process in
I
my
like it as a
location."
very
Looks around
general.
and says, "Oh, this is
kind
my
of thing.
process in my location."
as a
That must be
non-specific kind of thing.
what
the point
everybody
is that
else's
once you
process
start
is
putting
in
specific
their
on
location.
specifics on it, it breaks down.
once you try to say, oh, that's a good
So,
idea,
what
let me
came up
really
for me while
try
you were
to put
Yeah,
that into
just
practice,
speaking is
let me
that
try to apply that in a
every,
detailed way.
I
It-
remember,
Yes.
as an adolescent,
It breaks down.
getting into the
So, for example, have you ever had,
counterculture,
any of you had a conversation,
spiritual age,
and you are
and there
telling
was something very
a
exhilarating
very sort of
about
specific, very
tapping into
personal
what's very childlike. I
experience,
think all
and
children
someone says,
have
oh,
this.
yeah, I know just what you mean.
Certain
I know
children
just
have
what you
this.
mean.
That's really
Here's my
what
story.
they're-
Blah, 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 blah.
Adolescents.
And you go,
But I was
and you say,
applying
well,
it to my,
no,
my new spiritual,
actually,
right.
that's not what I mean. What I mean is this.
You know, that.
No, no, no,
there's
no,
something
no.
very
See, that's not what you
childlike
mean.
about assuming that everyone's
This is
the
what you
same.
mean. Yes.
You know,
What
at that
you
time,
mean
I
is like
assumed
what
that men and women
what I
were
share.
the same. This whole idea that we were different
So
was very old
perennialism,
stuff. You know, it was like people were really stuck in
in
their ideas.
contrast to what you,
Really
you
different.
said about owning
You know,
one's
so there was something
location and
very
saying, this is
comforting
my
about
process
the
in my
sameness of
location,
everyone, that,
looks
you know,
around and says,
but
oh,
I
this is my
could
process in my
recognize that
location.
as something that's
That must
kinda
be
adolescent.
What
It's,
everybody
you know,
else's process is
you know,
in
that
their
as we grow
location.
older, we recognize and discern differences, you know, more than we can when we're young.
So what
And
came
that
up
that's not a
for me
bad
while
thing,
you were,
it's part of
you know,
wisdom,
speaking
is
is
discern
that
the differences.
and
And
I remember
that,
as an adolescent, getting into the
that,
counterculture,
you know, we all know
spiritual
people who
age,
just are, love to
and there
connect
was
the
something
dots.
very
And, I mean, it's like, it's so exhilarating to be able
about
to
tapping
connect
into
dots
what's
and
very
see where
childlike.
things
I
are
think
really
all
resonating
children have
and
this, and most children have
synchronistic,
this,
and
certainly
it's all the
teenagers have
same,
this,
and,
that's where that
you know,
whole
quantum
pure
physics is the
discussion
same as
comes from,
spirituality, and it's,
adolescence.
you know, and it just
But I
gets
was
very
applying it to
exhilarating.
my-
But it's
my
very
new
childlike in a
spiritual
way as well.
Yeah.
And there's something,
really
you know, that there's something
lovely
very childlike about assuming that everyone's the
not
same.
Yes.
You know, at that
for the
time I even
sameness.
assumed that men and women, but owning oneself
Idea that we were
and
different
really
is very
honoring
old stuff.
the
You know, it's like
differences,
people were
whatever
stuck
they
in
are. I mean,
their
the
ideas.
mystery is in the differences, really.
You know,
That's
so
where
there was
mystery is.
something
I mean,
very
it's a good
comforting
mystery.
about
It's
Not
sort of
just
the sameness
loveliness,
of
but respect.
everyone that-
Yeah, respect,
Right,
right.
and I
You know,
can
and that,
recognize
and that,
as
it,
something that's
through that
kind of
honoring and
adolescent.
respect,
It's young.
there's even a
You know,
deeper
that as we
connection.
grow older, we
And
you
we
know,
learn
rather
something.
than the
Discern
scanning for
differences.
it, the
You know,
similarities.
We learned something we didn't
Yeah.
know before.
And that's not a bad thing.
Maybe.
It's part of.
I mean,
Often.
if we're not,
It's discerning
I'm not even talking about
differences.
having a conversation,
And,
but just in the beauty of,
you
just honoring the difference that really,
you know, we
I
all know
think-
people who
I
just
mean,
are
my
love to
experience when
connect
I
the dots.
speak
And,
of
I mean,
it
it's
is
like it's
one
so
of
exhilarating to be able to
modesty
connect dots and
one
see
of
where
sort
things
of
are really
being
resonating
more
and synchronistic, and it's all the same. And you know, quantum physics is the same as spirituality, and and it just gets very exhilarating. But it's very childlike in a way as well. And there's something, how do we all
really
connect? How do we all the same? How do we
lovely
all interconnect?
about
You know,
not
does that make sense? Scanning for the
same.
sameness.
Yeah.
By
This is one of
owning
the things that,
oneself
that
and
comes
really
up
honoring
in sort of
the differences, whatever they are. I mean, the mystery
What's
is in the
it called?
differences.
Diversity training.
Really, that's where mystery is. I mean, it's a good
teaching
mystery.
people
It's
not
sort
just
of-
recognize, but
when they're
respect.
speaking
yeah,
from
respect.
privilege.
Yeah, and that
When they're
it
speaking
through
from,
that honoring and
oh,
respect,
well, why don't you just,
there's even a deeper connection.
borrow the money, learn
rather
something,
than the
so go
scanning
start a
for
business. That's what
the
I did.
similarities.
We learned something we didn't know before. Not everybody's parents have enough
Maybe.
money.
I mean,
I'll
if we're
loan
not,
them for
I'm not
them
even
to
talking about
start
having a
business,
conversation,
$300,000
but just in the
to
beingness
get a
of,
business going.
just honoring the
Somebody who
difference.
says that is
Really,
not recognizing
I
that they're
think-
speaking for privilege.
I mean, my experience when I
He's assuming
speak
that
of
everybody
it
else
is
is the
one
same
of
when in fact they're not.
modesty and one of sort of
But here's a
being
question I
more
have for you.
at my own core.
Which is this.
You know,
From a
Trying to
perennialist
the
point of
connection
view,
junkie.
it's easy to say to
If
oneself,
it's
someone who's
always
in
Well,
1985 ran the
how do we all connect? How do we all the same? How are we all
I
interconnected?
don't like the
You know.
religion I was brought up in.
Does that make
It's not
sense to
answering
what-
my needs. I think I'm going to
Th-
join
this
as
is
Native
one of the
Americans
things
over
that-
there and do
that
some
comes
sweat
up in
lodging and
sort of,
really, I like what they have to say. I feel that's
what's
a
it
pretty
called?
groovy thing
Diversity
going on
training.
over there. So I'm going to take on
teaching
that
people
spiritual
to
practice.
recognize when they're
Yeah.
speaking for
And so
privilege.
many of us, right? We went out
When they're
and we
speaking from,
went to India, we
oh,
went to
well,
Mendocino County,
why don't
whatever
you
we
just,
did, to try
borrow the
on
money from your
spiritual
parents and
practices.
go start a business.
right?
That's what I did.
So
It's like, well,
there's something to be
not
said
everybody's
about
parents have enough
location
money
and
to
taking on
loan
other
them
spiritual
for them to
practices from
start
different
a
cultural
business.
locations
$300,000
in this
to get a business going.
conversation.
How,
Don't you think?
somebody who says that is not in a way that when you take on someone else's, is assuming that everybody
Spiritual
else is the
practice
same,
and when
pretend that
in
you're
fact
in
they're not.
their location you're really not in
But
their
here's a
location.
question I have. Well, pretend, or, I mean,
Which is this.
There's something to be
From
said for
paren-
people
from a
who do like
perennialistic
to
point of
take
view,
on spiritual
it's easy
practices
to
and
say to
it
oneself,
you
really
know,
connects.
someone who's,
Absolutely.
I mean, Pema
In
Chodron is really a
1985,
Buddhist,
Right.
spiritual
she's a
seeker.
Catholic.
You know,
Girl from Connecticut who's a
I
real
don't like
Buddhist.
the
You know,
religion I was brought up in.
some
It's
people-
not answering my
Yeah,
needs.
so there's
I think
some
the discussion
discussion
about
with
all
Native
this was-
Americans.
There's
over
a
there,
difference
sweat
between
lodging
spiritual
and-
tourism.
And, you know,
Really, I
We're
like
just
what
kind
they
of
have
going
to
around
say.
sampling
I
a little
feel-
bit of
that's
everything
a
one
pretty groovy
weekend.
thing
You're
going
at
on
Sweat
over
Lodge,
there.
and the next weekend
So I'm
you're
gonna
at Sleepy
take on
Dance, and
that
the next
spiritual
weekend you're at the
practice.
Self-Realization
You know,
Fellowship
and
doing
so many of us,
meditation.
right, we went out and
You know,
we
those
went to India,
versus
we went to Mendocino County,
really
whatever we did, you know, to
developing
try
a
on
relationship
spiritual
with
practices.
the culture and
right?
community that holds
So,
certain traditions.
There's something to be said
and
about
immersing yourself
location
in that
and taking on
becoming
other
part of that
spiritual
community.
practices from different cultural
That's really good.
locations in this
But then
conversation.
also, if that works
Don't
for
you
you
think?
and taking that on, being
In a way
place
that
with
when you
that,
take on someone else's
not because
spiritual
it's
practice
giving you
and
such
pretend that you're in
richness,
their location,
not
you're really
presuming
not in their
that
location.
that is what everyone
Well,
else should be
pretend,
doing
or,
too.
I mean, there, you
Like
know,
that's-
there's something to be said for people who do like
Well,
to
that's-
take on spiritual practices.
There's
and
a very
really
similar kind of
connects.
thing going on with the
I mean,
Russell
Pema
thing,
Chodron is really a
which is,
Buddhist.
it worked for me.
You know, she's a
It works
Catholic
for everyone.
girl from
It's sort of
Connecticut
like
who's a real
whether
Buddhist.
it's a-
You
so
know, but
The
some
Western
people-
notion that
you
everybody
know,
has
so
to
there's,
live in a
there is a
nation
discussion
state.
about all this. What
House
is-
of the Washer
There's
Dryer.
a
There's a difference between spiritual tourism,
Well,
where
Oh, you're so California.
Fellowship doing
to
meditation.
you know, those, you know, everyone in the world
really
should be
Christian, or everyone in the world should be
developing a
Muslim,
relationship with
the
or
culture and
whatever
community
it-
that
or everyone in
holds
the
a
world
certain
should
tradition.
be
And immersing yourself
you know,
in that,
whatever it is.
and
Everyone
becoming
should
part of
be
that.
Scientology,
Or everyone
That's
should be a
what-
vegan.
right?
yeah.
You know, I mean that too.
And also,
You know,
if
really
that works for you.
Right.
and
Whatever it is, it's
Right.
being
it's
in that place
it's
with
that same kind of assumption that
Not
everyone is
because
like
it's
me. So
giving
if I
you
benefit,
such richness,
they will too.
Not
Or if
presuming
they're not.
like me
They're
that is
wrong.
what everyone else should be doing too. Like
Right,
that's
or they're resisting.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's
What are they afraid of?
They're in denial.
Or
there's
not.
a very
Yes.
similar kind of thing going on. Where everyone
Process.
should go to therapy, which is worked for me.
What-
You know, whatever.
Well, that's an eternal truth.
Everybody has to live in a nation state in a house with a
Okay,
washer
so
and dryer.
Are we?
Oh, you're so California.
Saying that to kind of a
You know,
general everyone in the
view
world
doesn't serve a lot of
should
people.
be
It does.
Christian, or everyone
It's
in the
about
world should be
saying
Muslim,
that,
or
if you
whatever,
want
or everyone in the
to
world
apply it
should
very
be,
specifically
you know,
in the kind of
whatever it
culture
is
that we live
it
in,
should be.
it has some shortcomings. And
What's
it-
the?
It's unlikely to be the answer.
Yeah,
So
what-
this
what
is this is
that
what
really
this
makes
is what did it for
those
me. So
kinds
you
of
should be doing
things
it
like
too.
consciousness healing,
Or
and
what's the
transformation, spirituality, make them real in a scientific
The,
frame where more and more things are being explained. The headquarters in Florida, it's not John
answers.
Travolta.
Scientology.
Scientologists are the
Or everyone should be a
participatory
vegan.
approach. Right.
You know, I mean that too. You know,
Instead of saying whatever it is, it's
one goal.
It's that same
Because there are
kind of
many paths
assumption
and many
that
goals.
everyone is like me. So if I benefit,
And
they will too.
Or if they're not
It
like
also
me,
challenges the idea that the world is really
Right, or they're
in some
resisting.
sort of
Yes.
structural
Yeah.
way
What are they
divided
They're in
into
denial.
subject
Or
and
denial.
object.
Yes.
That in fact everyone should go to therapy. Subjectness and object,
Okay.
whatever.
Well, that's an eternal truth.
We can divide things just kind of on a
Okay, so,
experiential basis. Oh yeah, this is me. That's the couch.
Are we?
It's a
move
practical
on? Is it-
sort of approximation. So this is not about, but to try to say that's really how the world is when you look at it. Saying that that doesn't work either. Kind of a general perennialist view doesn't serve a lot of people. It does. So it's about the
saying
notion that if you want
is divided
to apply it
into
very specifically,
subject
in the
and
kind of
object
culture that we live
is
in,
part
it
of.
has some shortcomings. And the whole paradigm
It's
that
unlikely
assumes
to be
that
the
there's
answer
a-
that really
has
makes
to assume a
those
those
kinds
kinds
of
of behind
things
like
the
consciousness
world
healing
in
in order
transformation.
to
spirituality.
put back make them real aliveness in a
not just
scientific
in
frame
spirituality,
where more and more
transformation,
things are
whatever
being
it is,
explained,
like,
mechanism you want to call it. It's not, and sort of the participatory, instead
So
of
the
doing that
participatory
approach, erases that line and says, well, what happens
Instead
what happens
of
if we
saying
recognize
that there are
that's really
many
not
paths and one goal,
an effective way of
because there are
thinking
many
about
paths and many goals.
then, and that aliveness becomes part of the
It
world.
also
Subject
challenges the
becomes part
idea
of
that the
world.
world is really
Everything, in some sort
has
of some
some kind of
structural
subject
way,
is
divided into
and
subject
we
and object,
are
that in
participating in
fact,
that.
subjectness and objectness are, so we looked at
Properties of everything in the world.
three different models, the kind of,
And
typical
we can divide things
modernist
just
view
kind of on
is
a experiential
that
basis. Oh yeah, this
I
is
am
me,
outside
that's
of
the
the
couch.
world and I can look at
So
it.
a practical
And there's
sort of
one
approximation.
right way to look at it. But to try to say
And
that's
that's,
really how the
you know,
world is, we'll
we'll
just
just
do
look
experiments
at it
until we find what that one
That
right
doesn't
way
work
is.
either.
Now that comes with a particular state of consciousness. So the notion your sense of
that
yourself is sitting in
the
your
world
head
is
divided into that's
that
subject
makes
and
it seem like
object
the world is made
is
of pieces.
part of. So let's just
The
do a
whole
little paradigm
exercise.
that assumes that there's a that has to assume the
Now,
transcendental
relative to your
dimension
body,
behind
where is that
the world in order
Where is that
to
sense of the one who's looking?
put back
Is it
aliveness, consciousness,
in your
spirituality,
ankles,
transformation,
in your
whatever it is you,
knees?
you want to call it. And sort of
your head?
the participatory, instead of
Where is
doing
it?
that, erases that line and
Where
says,
is it
well, what
usually?
happens? What happens
Your
if we
eyes.
recognize that that's
Eyes,
really
somewhere up in your
not
head.
an effective
This
way
is
of
me.
thinking about it?
Up here.
I see,
Then
therefore I am.
that aliveness becomes.
I see,
part of the
therefore
world.
this is me in here and that thing
Subject
out there.
becomes
Yeah.
Everything has some kind of
So,
substance to it.
from a
And we
postmodern
are participating in
point
that.
of view, you can say, oh, but actually there's a lot of places
look
I
at
could be standing.
The three different models.
So if
kind
you
of the
look at the object that you're looking at,
typical
and you imagine
modernist
yourself
view
in
is
some other part of the
that
world,
I am outside of the world and I can
then
look at it.
you can imagine
There's
that
one
it would look
right
a little
way to
different
look
from
at
a
it.
different angle.
And that's, we'll just do experiments until we find what that one right way is.
But you're in your
Now
head
that comes
imagining.
with a particular state of
It's still the
consciousness.
same location.
It's still in the
just
same
wider.
Your sense of
location,
yourself is sitting
just
in your
recognizing
head.
that theoretically
That's,
you could be somewhere else.
that makes it seem like the world is made of pieces. So let's
it's
just do a little
still
exercise.
kind of like, it could be like this, but from somewhere else. The participatory version says, hey, you know what? There is nowhere outside the world to stand. There isn't a subject-object divide. My subjectness doesn't stop at the end of me, it extends into the world. And I'm part of this interconnected system. And anywhere, there isn't anywhere to look at the world from that isn't part of the world. So if I am looking at the world, I am part of what I am looking at. And that is a different state of mind. So what's it like? What do you notice? What do you notice about the experience?
When I looked at the statue, I just thought of metal, in shape. Then when I did it from the other location, I felt it in my heart, like whoever made it, that there was an energy, a creative force, that it went back more linearly. And then I also did the tangerines, and the tangerines to me felt alive, like there was an energy to them.
Did those two objects feel like objects in the same way that they did before?
No, they changed. Yeah, they were a little bit more flat, dimensional, just there, and then in the experience, and coming from a different location at me, they actually changed how I felt about them, and also what I perceived from them. and that there was like more dimension to them, whereas before they were more one or two dimensional.
So before they were more like things.
Things, yeah.
What were they more like now?
That there's depth, that there's much more depth.
Can you say what depth is?
Oh, depth is like, I guess, more connectedness.
Okay.
That you could trace it back.
So not so much separate from you.
I guess so.
Am I-
I'm working with the words.
Okay. All right, good.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I am struck by how quickly and easily I was able to fill up the space around me. It's like I was just right below the surface, and that space, that, well, what I call negative space, but it has a texture and a sound to it that's just so apparent the minute I'm guided into it. I'm so ready, and I'm kind of sad not to be back there. I kind of didn't want to.
Well, come on back down. Come on back in.
Yeah. It feels like that, you know? It feels like I could swim to you in it.
Mm-hmm. Has texture,
Yeah,
the presence.
and a sound.
And what's the sound?
It's the sound I'm aware of when I, when I sit in meditation. This energy around my ears. This velvet softness.
So when you sit in this
Pleasurable.
place,
Yeah, it's very pleasurable.
when you sit in this place and you feel that texture around you, can you feel that you have location in the world?
I don't know.
Can
I
you
don't have
feel that,
location.
okay, let's put it this way, can you feel that you have relationship with
Yes.
the world?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the extension of that is, when there's relationship, there's always location.
Mm-hmm.
Location is a way to talk about relationship. So that when I can feel my relatedness to the world, rather than imagining myself to be up above the world in some sort of non-located place and I'm just kind of looking at everything, when I'm located and I can feel my relationships, then it's obvious that the knowledge that I get from relationship with the world has to do with where I am in the world.
Right.
It's not some theoretical sort of extrapolation of how everything is, how it would be, how it would really be if nobody was looking at it. But I'm here looking at it, engaging with it, being in relationship from a very particular place.
It's striking to me that I'm steeped in infant and child development this weekend, so it's interesting to me that the infant comes into the world in exactly that state and then develops into separateness.
Mm-hmm.
That's a milestone.
Yes.
And that we must carry that because it was so, as I said, it's so immediately just below the surface, this idea that we can unseparate it, we can integrate.
So here's a question. Do you think that all cultures in all times have gone through that same kind of individuation process?
I think they're, from what I know, that all humans develop in certain, in all humans put marks on paper or marks on something in a pretty predictable way, no matter what their culture is. And that humans, babies, yes, I think yes. I think that human babies, or I'm asking you, are human babies not, do they not need to develop to the point where they know where their boundaries are and where they start and where they stop?
So when you were sitting here, down here, and really immersed in feeling yourself in the space around you, where did you stop? Where was the end of you?
Well, the walls only because we came back. But I imagine that we could.
While you were in here,
Yeah,
where did you stop?
At you?
So there's a difference in your experience of where you stopped from one state to another state.
Mm-hmm.
Is what I'm hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems like maybe that's something that is not always the same. That we can be in different states of mind and have a different experience of where we stop.
Oh.
Which
Right, I
means
think we merge when we fall in love, for instance. You know, we feel emerging more.
different kind of
Mhm.
connectedness.
We tear apart when we have a strong emotion. That, you know, we literally talk about withdrawing,
Mhm.
you know, when we're sad or angry. So I guess it would be fair to say that throughout a lifetime that that sense of it ebbs and flows.
So do you think it's possible for different cultures to maybe have different senses of where we start and stop?
Yes.
Have you ever had someone from a different culture come up and stand uncomfortably close to you?
Right, yeah, right. I'm not quite sure are you suggesting here that in some cultures an infant does not learn those boundaries, or?
I'm suggesting that we learn them differently because there isn't an absolute place where we start and stop.
Mm-hmm.
There are different cultural locations.
Mm-hmm.
There are different cultural experiences that we get trained into.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Northern European, some parts of American culture, it's like, well, you know, I'll reach my hand out to shake yours, and that's about as close as I want to get.
Right.
Because, you know, 2 arms length away, then I'm standing close to you, talking to you.
Right. I mean, there's indigenous people who keep their babies literally attached to the mother for 4 years.
Right.
And the mother knows immediately when the baby, she needs to take the baby off so that the baby can poop and, you know, and puts the baby back on.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Well, you know, Joseph Chilton Pierce talks about that in the Crack the Cosmic Egg. He talks about, and then, you know, those babies in those cultures, their developmental milestones are way earlier than Western cultures. I mean, babies are, you know, sitting up at 3 months and crawling, at 6 months, so much earlier. And yet, at age 4, in a tribal society, those babies then, as I recall, are taken off of the mother, and now they have to be part of the larger society, and so they experience a traumatic loss. You know, I'm done with you now, and then their path becomes different than our path, and how we.
So, do you think it's possible that the assumptions that we have around reality that are part of the scientific project are shaped by our particular cultural way of defining where we start and stop?
Wait, say that again?
Do you think that the assumptions that go along with science might be shaped in part by our cultural experience of where we start and stop.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's what this has all been about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a simple way of saying to somebody, there's actually some cultural, this isn't just pure empirical science.
Mm-hmm. The tree is not green.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The tree is green in this culture.
Right. To
But-
our eyes right now, the tree is green.
Right.
Yeah. You
But
know,
science is not this neutral, just the way it is, you know, whether deGrasse Tyson says so or not. You know, you don't have to believe it's science, that's just the way it is. There are some parts, that's a matter of degrees. Because there's something about the whole lens that you're looking through when you're doing science that is very culturally shaped.
Mm-hmm. I found myself wondering half an hour ago, you know, you're presenting us, your presentation, you know, what interests you and what you believe to bring us closer to some kind of truth. But, you know, your Chinese counterpart, you know, or your Vietnamese counterpart, or, you know, somewhere in some other part of the world, in some living room now, somebody could be sitting in that chair and looking at this from a completely different perspective.
And no doubt they are.
And sitting a lot closer.
And to me, it's not about getting closer to some truth. It's about repairing the fact that in our culture we don't make room for consciousness, aliveness, transformation, any of those things. We don't make room for it when we're talking about what's really true. So for those of us who are involved in that kind of work, how do we talk about it in a way that is viable in our culture? Because our culture, our scientific culture, has bought into a certain set of assumptions and has stopped questioning them. And therefore it just assumes that if people are talking about those consciously, yeah, whatever, you know, they're just entertaining themselves. That's not how it really is.
Yeah.
And I think a couple of people have asked today, you know, what is that? How do you talk about it? And what is the practical application or daily practice in everyday life to have that kind of conversation that, you know, isn't happening enough?
So there's a couple of things. One being, if in talking with somebody who's just like in ordinary, you know, not an intellectual discussion of philosophy, is to say that the lens that you're taking on when you're doing science actually is actually shaped by our Western culture. That it makes certain assumptions about where I start and stop, and it makes the assumption that there's a separation between me and the world, when in fact, if you look at it closely, that isn't necessarily the case. And if that isn't the case, then the aliveness, the intelligence, the consciousness that I feel within myself is really a natural aspect of the world. That there isn't an inside and an outside. That the way it is in here is just a corner of how it is in the world.
So this focus that we put on, in this culture anyway, on first of all, do you buy this idea that that it's a human truth that infants come into the world without a sense of separation and develop that sense in all cultures?
That develop some sense of separation, perhaps differently, end up in different locations, in different relationships to other people and to the world, but with more of a sense of self than they had. I mean, some indigenous cultures, from what I've read anyway, you know, it's like, well, okay, when you see a flock of birds and they're flying, and it's like the whole cloud, it's like a cloud of birds, and they turn as one. You know, it's like there's all kinds of ways to try to explain, well, they're actually kind of looking at each other out of the corner of their eye. You know, it's like, I don't know, I don't buy that. I think there's a way in which they have partially merged their presence and they work as a single organism. A collective
So-
organism.
And they have evolved to have that instinct. They have an instinct, correct?
Well,
And the instinct is to,
whatever that means.
I mean, I recently read that they took some baby owls at birth
Mhm.
and they fitted their eyes with a different lens and they developed a non-owl brain.
Mhm.
So you could take, well, we do this all the time. We go into other cultures and we adopt their babies and we bring them into our culture and they become Americans, they
Mhm.
become Westerners.
Mhm.
So, yeah, go ahead. I don't know what
The
your
point I was
mind-
wanting to make is that in some indigenous cultures, I think that the cohesion of the group is much greater than it is in this culture.
Ah, I see what you're saying, yeah.
So in general, yes, people develop a certain level of self-awareness, but I think that where we get to in different cultures is really different.
But they also have daily practice and generations of similar practice, so that you grow up learning or knowing that without even language, that these things, this is how life is,
Which you could call instinct.
which you could call instinct.
Well, it's a
Or-
transmission.
There is some transmission,
It's
and
transmission.
and
which-
it's
which-
infused in the, the space. What's interesting about the people being too close is that some cultures you can feel, like on the one California bus, it's like a little too close. But you can also I can be in a subway in Tokyo with, tens of thousands of people, and there's no sense of that energetic encroachment. I'm not sure how they do
Because
that.
they sit
Yeah.
differently.
Do they sit differently in their bodies?
They sit differently, and there's a respect, I
Energetic.
think.
Mhm.
So when you were talking about that exercise, you can go out, but not like bump into people, but still be kind of in the same space.
Learn to be transparent
Mhm.
to each other in a way. Transparent but boundaried.
Very boundaried. Which is, it's particular to Japanese culture.
So this is class
They're all
two.
ritualistically about their boundaries.
Yeah. And I think that there's, with the indigenous cultures, there's a consistent, I don't want to say message, but consistent story, or
A cultural city.
right? It's consistent across generations. It's not, it doesn't change.
So I have a question that's really been part of my focus for quite a few years, which is, as Mary said, you take a baby out of a culture and you bring them to America and they become Americans. Well, we're all babies that have been taken out of all other cultures and we've all become Americans. So, despite that we get acculturated to the Western culture of the United States, whatever region we're from, because that also has something to do with it, how much through our DNA, whether physical or otherwise, DNA can operate on different dimensions, are we still being called to that indigenous transmission that however many generations back we actually come from? And does that transmission have some sort of impact on who we are in the world and how we see the world, or the kind of practices we should or do or could use in order to return to ourselves in a more profound way? that really pierces through our sort of American persona. You know, that's
Yes.
speaks to our indigenous self, whoever and whatever that was.
There was a little bit of research done with adopted children, and it seemed that they took on a lot of the attributes of the adopted parents and family and really blended in. But then once they reached a certain age, and it was like after 18, it was like 20-ish or something, that what was underneath and where they came from started to surface more.
I work almost exclusively with adopted children and international adoptees, and that is a piece that they carry with them. Oh, well, first of all, they don't look anything like the people who are raising them often, so that's an obvious on the external. But there is always a yearning for something else, even in the best families and the best kids. Yeah.
Hey, every kid I have ever met doesn't believe their parents are their parents. They are yearning for something better. It's true.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, the grass is always greener.
It's not that. It's that they know a truth inside themselves that has never been reflected from their parents.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with what Mary was saying, and it's the truth of not being disconnected. I don't think we ever lose that, and I think all our spiritual practices are merely mirrors for bringing us back there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take talking to them, it takes reflecting.
Yeah. So even if you were adopted, if we were all connected, then you wouldn't feel that emptiness because you would know you were connected. This is just a different family, but part of the greater whole.
I think it's a different question.
Yeah.
Can you speak more to that? That it's a different question.
I don't think it has to do with anything about the cultural stuff. I think a lot of that, and what Mary was talking about, working with adoptees, I think there is so much absorbed in the neural development in utero that there's that part of what's missing in this reality that I'm being raised in. But I think deeper than that is this sense of non-separation from.
But I think what Michaela was talking about, I think if you move when you're young and your environment changes and the culture changes, then you feel, I don't know, more conflicted maybe. I have friends that grew up, a friend that grew up in Missouri, 6, 7 generations, and Vermont, 6, 7, 8 generations in the same area. They don't have the same, conflict. They kind of, their roots are deeper or something.
Like my parents immigrated from Denmark, and I was raised with my parents and their friends. And it's like there's still a cultural gap in my experience between myself and the culture that I live in, even though I was born and raised here.
I think the immigrant experience is a particularly odd phenomenon or distinctive phenomenon.
Yeah, very much like the adoptee phenomenon.
I mean, if you go to Montreal, I haven't been there for 40 years, but to me it felt like a homogeneous culture. I've never been in an American city that felt like a homogeneous culture. It's the fact that there hasn't been a change for 6 generations.
Well, do you feel that, are you first generation American or second generation? You're second generation, so your grandparents were immigrants.
Yeah, but they raised me.
Right, so you were raised in between worlds, basically. I mean, you were assimilating, basically. I grew up in an assimilating home. So we were very American, but there was always this pull that we weren't like them at all. There was like as a child, you were expected to live in 2 different worlds. You probably had that experience coming from Japan. So can you speak more to how that was for you?
Well, in my environment, all the other kids I knew were in exactly the same place I was, so it didn't feel that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shared between worlds.
we had our own in-between world.
Mhm.
And the few kids who had a very strong identity to a religious Jewish culture seemed like, how did they get that?
But so this is interesting. This is interesting because so I'll ask the question, or let me see how I can phrase it. So do you find that your peer group were actually more of your grounding relationships than actually your relationship with your family? That there's something about the peer group that was very, very powerful in that experience that really gave you the entrance.
Well, they were different
to-
relationships. And I think this discrimination that Mary made about being born in an integrated place, and then the question is what happens with different cultures, is my parents were kept in, I drew a line.
In
I drew a line
Oh,
between the culture of the family and the culture of my peers.
right.
And then I went off to college, which was a completely different environment because we had quotas for Jews in those days. And it didn't make any sense to me. I mean, there was just there were a few individuals who crossed a boundary, but as a context, I had to go to Europe after to find out I belonged to the world. Yeah.
And this brings up another kind of fundamental idea in human development, which is the idea of attachment. As I'm thinking about it, again, I've been steeped all weekend in this idea that nothing happens in the world that I live in and work in without a strong attachment. So
Yeah.
where does that fit in to this idea that you're born and you come into this world with no separation, no sense of your physical boundaries, but an intense need, at least here, to have a strong attachment. That we really know that people who don't have a strong, healthy attachment in the early days of their life are going to have trouble in life. So how does that fit into where this idea of separateness
Well,
again?
my sense is that our perceptual unity is very different from our body's need for nurturance.
I wonder, David, if that's true. If you can separate
Well,
those things.
our body gets an immediate reflection from a separated physicality.
Right, but it also bathes the brain in certain, chemicals, as the infant, has this physical experience, it creates, a neurological response.
Okay, so I'd like to bring this back to the sort of the discussion of the different frames. So what frame of reference did you just use?
Child development,
Yes,
Western
but
child
in terms
development.
of modern, postmodern, perennialist
Ah.
participation,
Oh,
which
I
model
didn't know
did
there was
you
going to be a test today. Do I get to make a phone call? I'm making it to Glenn. I don't know.
when you just said, well, there's chemicals that bathe the brain.
Ah,
It's like
what?
perennial, modern.
It's a very modern frame,
A modern frame, yeah, okay.
okay, because that's the world as particles.
Mhm. Yeah,
right? Particles create personhood.
right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, the point is, there's nothing wrong with any frame. The question is, are we using one that works for the context that we're in?
And are we too narrowly defining? Is that-
And are we taking one and saying, oh, that's the real one, and all the other ones aren't real?
Correct. Which is what the neuroscience science would
Which is
say,
which
tells.
is which is the dilemma that we started working with. The fact is that we live in a culture that has taken one of those frames and said that's the real
That's the
one,
one.
and all the other ones are not real. So, so let me put the question back to you, because all of you have experience with that frame of reference. Oh, well, we're doing this healing process, this process to work with you, to help bring out something from you. But really what's happening is this chemical thing, this behavioral thing, this belief thing, this, you name it, fill in the blank, right? Come up against that all the time. In a psychology setting, in a medical setting, in a setting of that has any kind of sort of cultural oversight, like who's going to get the funding, who gets the license, who gets the
Prescription.
prescription,
The patients, the clients.
whatever it is.
Mhm.
There's this reversion to here's what's really happening,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So you all know that experience of coming up, and when you bump up against that, you're bumping up against the modernist frame, and you're bumping up against the fact that there's a cultural phenomenon where we give that one reality and we don't give reality to anything else, right?
As
So
long as it's mine, it's okay.
then if somebody says, oh well, that's just a belief system, the way I look at it is like this. This is the way I talk to myself about it, and those are the people they talk to. They talk like that, but this is how I talk. What frame is that?
That's my
That's actually a little different than perennial.
It's the one where 3 or 4 people were looking at the picture.
Postmodern.
Mm.
Postmodern.
Oh,
This is how I look at it, but you could look at it from anywhere, and it doesn't really matter. It's just how you look at it.
Right.
Okay. If somebody says, I came for this particular kind of work, but I know any kind of work would get me the same place. What kind of lens is that?
Lumpy gravy?
No?
No.
Participatory.
No?
Oh,
The one,
yeah,
the one with
yeah.
all the.
That's the perennialist.
The perennialist.
Oh.
Yeah.
There's a hidden dimension to the world that has a particular shape, and it doesn't matter which door you go through.
You get to the same.
You're going to get to the same thing. Go to different cultures, they're all doing the same thing. Different spiritual practice, they're all doing the same thing. Different therapies, they're all doing the same thing. What I'm doing is really what everybody else is also doing.
Glenn, you had an image, a slide, and maybe we could go back to it because I thought it was so incredible. You were showing how things appear on the surface to not be connected. It was like some water, but if you went below the water, you could see where the connection was.
That was about the Jungian psychology versus the Freudian.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay.
If you go where the Freudian is if you go deeper inside,
Mm-hmm.
you just end up in this very private, isolated place that no one else has access to.
Right.
Where the Jungian notion is, if you go deeper inside, you get into this shared space where the inside of you is the inside of the world and of everyone else. You may have a different location in it, but you're connected. You go inside and you end up in the world.
Yeah, that was a really,
That was a good slide.
it was a really good slide. Yeah. That was really good.
So, how do you feel you could say something in response to somebody who's trying to impose a modernist frame on you? Trying to say, well, really what's happening? It's just chemicals. We know how these things work. They just follow certain rules, certain chemicals. That's really all that's happening. If you're experiencing something more than that, well, that's great. That's nice. That's nice for you. I'm happy for you. That's not what's really happening. What's really happening is the brain is being bathed in certain chemicals.
A little acid in there too. You can't talk to them.
No, it just
Have some?
And that is the LSD experiences of the 1960s is in fact what created a cultural shift.
Mhm.
But for yourself, how do you feel any different in how you can respond to a modernist frame when it feels like it's squeezing the life out of what you're trying to do?
That's all you can say, is squeezing the life out of what I'm trying to do.
Well,
Doesn't speak to me.
okay.
It's a different paradigm.
So, but it happens to be empirically true.
In your perception. In your
Well, but
paradigm.
I'm a scientist, and look, I can cite all this research, and it's clear.
Well, I'm going to the park and I'm going to go skipping down the hill, thank you. That's the way I've coped with it in my life.
Right. And so what I'm asking is whether there's anything out of this that,
Right.
that you're able to take away that gives you a different place to stand.
Other than giving them a reflection of an experience they haven't brought into their consciousness.
Right.
Yeah, I think for me,
You can't penetrate it this way, I don't think.
I would agree, and at the same time, there is a way to communicate about location that can be, that is less easy to discount.
Well, that exercise that you took us through,
Mhm.
location specifically.
yeah, I think what I'm taking away is just, I don't want to say live and let live, but it's kind of like that's your frame of reference, and you're based in this scientific empirical world, and I'm not. And not to argue or to change minds or convince or anything, but just there's a more of a tolerance or acceptance, that both can kind of coexist in the same.
But
So-
verbally, I don't think you can talk with those kind of people to change anything, because it is what it is.
Right, but I
So,
and
Yeah,
I
but
don't.
you've been trying to give us the language for the last 6 weeks,
Yeah.
And we're not, obviously, we're not getting it yet, so.
I'm not
We paid big
suggesting.
bucks for this. I want an answer.
I'm mute, that's hysterical.
I like that. Okay, here's the thing. This is not so much for people
Here's
who
the
are
answer.
deeply steeped in scientific culture, because it is an acculturation, and that's one of the points, is that it is a culture, just in the same way that the French have a certain attitude about coffee and baguettes. People with a scientific training have a certain attitude about evidence and the nature of reality. You're probably not going to get them. Okay? But for people who come and are confused about it, and who are kind of mouthing the language of culture and saying, well, I kind of feel this, but it's probably not real because, I guess that's not really what's happening. Because they say that it's just some chemicals that are bathing my brain. So maybe what I'm experiencing, I'm just making it up. What could you say to that kind of person?
You really are crazy. It's okay.
Well, I think I could, you could take someone through this very user-friendly and accessible little exercise that we just did, that I think is also a universal truth.
At least
feels
it's a
like-
located experience that gives a different perspective.
Right.
Right.
I think I think people people are craving this and don't even know it, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what
Yeah.
could you say to those people?
Well, when I have this experience very frequently as an art therapist. People come into the studio, they go, I don't like to draw. Yeah, I draw like a 10-year-old. It's true, they do, because we stopped teaching at 10 how to draw. I find that if I just put out the right materials, 30 minutes, without saying anything, 30 minutes later I can't stop people because I think they're starving for a creative experience and they don't know it, myself included. So if we unpack the information, or if you provide the experiential event to people, I think most people are ready and accessible to that, and
Okay.
want it.
Okay. And then how would you talk about it?
I'm not sure that I would, but I'm getting that we should have a language when we leave here.
We should.
Well, I mean, I would like to have a language when we leave here. Let me say it like that.
I'm suggesting there's an opportunity for a language.
Right.
I
Ah.
But we'll come back to this. I want to go a little bit farther
Okay.
here. So I'm suggesting that this whole idea that particles produce persons is actually the result of a particular way of inhabiting yourself. When we have the sense of self sitting in the head, that seems obvious. That the beliefs about this actually come from a particular state of mind. And that when you go to grad school and you get a scientific training, you're not only getting language and processes, you're also getting inducted into a particular state of mind. And the belief is that that particular state of mind is the real one, as opposed to that it's just one possible state of mind. So that when people come and they want to be treated in a way that is sort of reflecting, in your word, reflecting their aliveness, cultivating their healing and transformation, rather than being treated like a machine. Connected, relational, alive,
Sensory.
intelligent, all of those things, that they're reflecting the fact that this scientific posture is missing something. It's not satisfying. It's not something that helps people heal. It's not something that helps people transform. It's not something that gets them to feel
That's very
treated
true.
like an intelligent living process. It makes them feel like they're treated like a machine. And how many people like that? People hate that because it actually blocks their ability to learn, to transform, to heal.
And yet cognitive behavioral therapy is the watchword of our faith.
Exactly.
You know, it's the Bible.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
So healing, yes, it's about, certain kind of structures and interventions and so on and so forth, but it's also about reflecting aliveness, inspiring people, getting people back in touch with their relationships, with their interconnectedness with the world. And that is something very different in the language of our culture. We have, in the language of our culture, we have the modernist idea that things are really just particles. We have the postmodernist idea, it's all in how you look at it. And we have the religion idea, which is, well, whatever it looks like, there's a secret dimension behind that explains everything. And the participatory model gives an alternative that makes room for the aliveness, the consciousness, the healing, the transformation, that can also be used in a scientific context. And
Really interesting slide.
don't know why.
And it's really just as simple as recognizing that the subject, the belief that we have that there's an in here and an out there is a cultural belief that doesn't stand up to close examination. That the aliveness that we feel in here is the same aliveness that inhabits the world.
Can you say that once more?
But the aliveness that we experience in here, internally within ourselves, is the same aliveness that inhabits the world.
So if you don't have the aliveness in here, you can just go and grab it and connect to out there.
Well, you can't just do that. That requires moving into a different state of mind. But here's the thing. Science has not been able to study the mind. It
Right.
only studies the brain and reports and what people say about their experience of the mind. But if you come into this different state of mind, this way of interconnectedness, then you can begin to study the mind more directly. And the work that we teach is about how to study the mind and learn how to use the mind in a different way. So that if you want to have boundaries are not some theoretical thing that you just go, oh, well, yeah, I guess I should have boundaries. Okay, let me think about having boundaries. Okay, I don't want to let you in. Okay, now I have a boundary. Or I'm going to say something that's going to shut you up, and that's a boundary. But it's actually a quality of presence. It's actually something in the way that you sit in your body, and you can feel exactly what it's like to have that boundary. If you have difficulty concentrating or focusing or sustaining attention, that there's a particular way you can learn to sit inside yourself. There's a particular way you can hold your mind, and you can, oh, I need to concentrate now. I'm going to go to that place. Oh, here I am. Okay, now I can do this. Oh, I've been really stressed. I need to just chill. Oh, I know where how I can direct my mind to do that. Oh, I need to connect with this person. How is it that I do that? How do I move from this thinking place to the place where I can actually connect with this person? Oh, I have a speaking engagement. Oh God, I'm going to be really scared up there in front of people because public speaking scares me. What can I do? And I'm afraid they're not going to listen to me. What can I do? How can I hold my presence in a way where they're actually going to hear me? I'm actually going to have some impact. All of those things, when we start looking at the mind from this different state of awareness, become simple processes.
You just described exactly what things like CBT address: anxiety, social dysfunctions. But you just, this idea that one could treat, that this is not necessarily the treatment of choice, and that there's a whole other way to look at these things.
There's a whole other way to look at it, and a whole other way, and a whole other way to teach them as simple skills, presence-based skills,
Right.
where you don't have to go through the words of the thinking mind, but you can go through the sensate experience of the living body and find exactly what it's like to do that thing, so that you can find your way back there.
And oftentimes encounter trauma along the way and work from that location with the trauma. So it's not conceptual. It's very sensate based.
Right.
Right.
And have you ever worked with children around this approach?
A couple times, not, I haven't had a lot of opportunity yet, a little bit yet. Children are very receptive.
I would think so.
Much easier.
Sure.
That'd be great.
Sure,
It'd be
they-
great
they-
to do a study.
Their boundaries are much more permeable.
Yeah.
But they seem
also
to be
there's
more,
I'm sorry.
yeah, open. They're open and not as complicated.
Well, they're also not as much, they haven't been acculturated totally into their heads yet.
Yeah.
And the only reason we go into our heads is because the transmission that we receive from everyone around us, is head-based transmission.
Right.
If we were around adults as we grew up, who were embodied and were transmitting, and really embodied not only their physical body, but were embodying their energetic bodies, we would stay that embodied ourselves. We shrink to fit in with what the norm is around us.
Right. We call those defenses in some circles.
Yeah, but it's really, I think about just, again, the acculturated entrainment. We tend to follow the transmission
it's like walking, if you walk into a meditation hall where there's been real work, done, usually we can feel something when we encounter it. It's that texture you were talking about. I mean, it's like, it's very, very sensately real. My experience is that we feel that all the time with each other's presence. That there's something that's very sensately real when one encounters someone who's very embodied and very, very present and holding big, holding strong presence. One can feel that. I think if, children are around that kind of presence, they check into their own sense of presence, which is innately there.
Right. I would agree with that, yeah.
When they're around, people who are in their heads and running the head thing, kids are taught to, and actually Glenn talks about what happens at the age of 7, which also, something that we see, Cosmic Egg, and the second book he wrote, the Magical Child, where at 7, there's a, well, you could talk about
Contraction of the presence and it goes up into
right,
the
up
head.
into the head.
Right.
And then boom, you're sort of stuck there because you've got all that acculturated affirmation. That's where we're supposed to live. So
We finally got to be like mommy and daddy.
yeah, exactly, and
Even though I needed
and
them
be
when
okay
I
in
was-
try to be okay in school, because school acculturates us to that. But with attention dynamics, it's this work that Glenn has put together. It's really about, again, going back, down and out, really getting those sensate
Down and
cues.
out.
Down and
Down and out. That's
and out.
interesting, yeah.
And up and down, actually. But
Yeah, right.
yeah. So
Some
that-
direction we're not used to going.
Well, it's just
It's
like that slide
slow.
we were talking about. When you go deep enough inside, you encounter the world.
Yeah.
But you encounter the world in a different way, not as a set of objects that's separated from you over
Uh-huh.
there,
Right.
but as you're part of the team.
Yeah.
And not just children, but animals too. So, like Strozzi's work with horses, and they do all this leadership training around horses, and there's so much information that you get from how horses are reacting to people.
Glenn and I have done some really wacky stuff, like, once we really practiced this work, and this was quite a few years ago, of really being embodied, and, we played around a lot with inhabiting different chakras and doing back-to-back and being able to feel what chakra the other person was in, and, we played around with a lot of that stuff. And then we go to a museum, and stand in front of paintings to get into that state and feel what presence the paintings had, what kind of presence, what kind of how much was radiating out, did the artist have the ability to really imbue presence into the paintings? So the paintings became basically more sort of radiating, energetic, living pieces, the way Samantha talked about, that the tangerines became more living, connected, entities. With great fun, people thought we were probably nuts, standing in front of these, but that's,
We know you're nuts.
yeah,
That's
that's
why
true.
we're here.
But that it's like when some of us, took drugs and really started perceiving the world, and really stuff shifted, how we perceive stuff shifted, and my experience is that when we can shift into different locations, that our perception really, really shifts. And people respond to us differently because unconsciously they know something else is going on, and they start, unconsciously sorting through their own system to meet us somewhere. So you can actually,
Feel that.
you're doing your own transmitting at the same time that you're, perceiving differently, you're transmitting differently, which opens up very different kinds of relationships, even if you're not talking about transformation. It's just sort of there.
It's like if you were trying to develop the field of psychology in a very uptight society of 19th century Vienna, you would call these unconscious processes of transference and countertransference. But if you've spent some time doing embodiment work, and you can actually feel those things happening, then those are dynamic qualities of presence that you can work with directly and consciously. So it changes you change your state of mind, it changes the whole playing field.
Well, it certainly takes, the whole idea of pathology, it really shifts pathology out of pathology.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to talk to somebody about transformation who is locked in the scientific? I still don't get a sense that there's any way to break through that except experientially.
I think you're right, but making the argument that the subject-object dichotomy is a construct, is a cultural construct that actually has no empirical basis,
Right.
is a way to undercut the assumptions that sit implicitly and unspoken within a scientific approach, a standard scientific approach.
I think I've been having this conversation with everybody in my environment ever since I was 4 years old.
Yeah.
Right.
And
John
another
Wayne.
piece that's just as important for me is that my tendency, since I was 4 years old, was to engage in sort of those conversations too. But I was trained to get really in my head and be, highly intellectual. And what my experience is that if I can hold location and stay embodied while being in that kind of dialogue, that first of all it softens my resistance. So I'm not meeting; it's not head to head and argument to argument. And my embodied state has an impact on the quality of the conversation,
Is it
to some extent.
an interesting little piece of research that I came back across the other day, which some of you probably know, the Myers-Briggs. People who believe in the quote supernatural tend to be intuitive and feeling types. People who are more sensate and thinking, that is just looking at the world and, well, what you see is what you get, don't. Probably because they don't actually have those kinds of experiences. They don't have an experiential basis. And so it's like we have developed a science. People with the sensate and the thinking tend to be the ones who are more attracted to science. So what we have is an entire scientific discipline that is based on the perceptions of a particular type of temperament. Whether people who have other kinds of perceptions and relationship to the world, our science excludes them. Our science hasn't included the kind of knowledge that people like that are capable of gathering. So we have restricted ourselves to a subsection of the population and say, whatever your experience is, which is kind of like saying, well, let's let all the people who decide paint colors, let's make sure that they're the colorblind people.
Mm-hmm.
So let's send colorblind people in and have them define how buildings should be, how buildings should be painted, what the color scheme should be. And then everybody else is being driven crazy. It's like, these colors don't work. I'm sorry, all our experts agree that these colors do work.
Well, that's a very postmodernist reality too.
In what way?
In the sense that that's what buildings look like.
Oh, well, yes.
The trainer that I've been spent the weekend with, he said, if we don't have a word for it, then we just don't, this doesn't exist for us. And he said part of his work has been trying to find a word to describe behaviors of children that we just, we called it something it wasn't.
That's actually the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that if we don't have a word for it, it doesn't exist.
Right.
They've actually done research on that and found it isn't entirely true. But within academic disciplines, it is much more true. So within psychology, if we don't have a word for it, it's much more that way. People are not allowed to take
Right.
their sort of, their felt sense, oh, something isn't quite right here. We're not allowed to do that in a professional setting. Ordinary, people in ordinary life can and do that. But so it would be interesting to go back and test that same hypothesis in a professional setting as opposed to just ordinary people and see if it isn't more true within a professional setting.